Smoke curled through the pines like living shadows as a single rifle shot cracked the night, sending echo after echo ricocheting off the jagged rocks. The moon glinted on spilled cartridges and a toppled stagecoach wheel, silent witness to desperation and betrayal on a 100-mile trail. Somewhere beyond the crash, hoofbeats, thundered hearts pounded, and a lone figure pressed against frost-chilled timber blood, still warm on gloved fingertips. In the valley's hush that followed the wind, whispered promises of justice and a vengeance of second chances born amid ruins. Under an endless western sky, the embers of hope and retribution smoldered together, waiting for one spark to ignite the blaze. The moonlight slipped through ragged clouds as Elizabeth Harper's rattling stagecoach clattered across the high mountain pass, each wooden wheel grinding against icy stones. A sudden gust of wind whipped the coach door open, and she caught a glimpse of the dark silhouette of the Rockies looming overhead, jagged spires that seemed to pierce the very heavens. Bundled in a threadbare wool shawl, Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as the coach jolted to a stop. Ahead, the snarling forms of three mounted figures emerged from the gloom, faces obscured by scarves, revolvers glinting with lethal promise under the pale light. "Hold fast," bellowed the driver, but his voice trembled with fear. The outlaws charged, spurred by desperation and greed, their horses snorting steam in the frigid air. Elizabeth's breath caught as one rider swung down, creeping toward the coach's side to pry open the door. Inside, she fumbled for the small derringer hidden at her waist, her only protection during this 1,000-mile journey from Boston to the frontier town of Pine Creek. The stage lights flickered in her trembling hand as she aimed through the narrow window slit. A sudden crack of rifle fire shattered the night. A lone shot rang out, echoing against the rock walls. The would-be robber froze, startled, and the other two riders reined back. Elizabeth's shawl slipped, revealing her pale face. Before the outlaws could regroup, a second shot rang, this time from the opposite side of the coach, and the assailants wheeled their horses and fled into the dark. When Elizabeth managed to open the door, she found her savior standing amid swirling snow. John McAllister, a silver-haired rancher whose broad shoulders and weather-worn face bore the marks of countless seasons on these unforgiving heights. His Winchester rifle, still warm to the touch, rested at his side. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate through the frozen night. Elizabeth nodded, her fingers numb around the pistol. "Thank you," she whispered, voice quivering. John offered a steady arm. "Climb down easy," he instructed, scanning the rocky slope for any sign of the outlaws. Her heart hammered as she stepped onto the narrow ledge, the wind tearing at her skirts, but John's firm grip guided her safely. He hoisted her small trunk and shawl onto his horse, then led the animal back toward the coach. "I'll get you to Pine Creek," he said simply, "but we best move fast before they circle round." Moments later, Elizabeth rode between the towering pines under John's watchful eye, the stagecoach's coachman muttering thanks from behind. Every branch dripped with ice, and the moon shone like a ghostly lantern on the snow-blanketed world. She marveled at her rescuer's calm confidence. Where she saw peril, he saw only duty. The night air burned her lungs with each breath, but she drew courage from John's silent determination. As they descended into the valley, the flickering glow of Pine Creek's distant lanterns welcomed them like a lighthouse in a storm. Elizabeth's knuckles whitened around her shawl as she realized that despite her plan to wed a prominent rancher here, the journey had already taken a turn she never expected, and this silver-haired stranger might hold her fate in his steady hands. The glow of oil lamps guided John McAllister and Elizabeth Harper through Pine Creek's dusty main street, where wooden sidewalks creaked under their boots. Elizabeth's fingers still trembled from the night's ambush, but now her breaths evened out as she absorbed the frontier town's restless energy. A cluster of storefronts, general store, saloon, blacksmith, crowded against a backdrop of skeletal pines and distant mountain silhouettes. John kept his rifle slung over one shoulder, but his posture relaxed. Here at least open daylight would temper the hidden threats of the mountain pass. He led her to the boarding house run by Mrs. Clara Fletcher, a stout woman whose apron hugged her ample frame. Evening, John. Mrs. Fletcher greeted him with a curt nod, eyeing Elizabeth's travel-stained cloak. "Right smart of you to bring her in before a second ambush." Elizabeth managed a grateful smile as Mrs. Fletcher ushered her into a spare room, small, but featuring a neatly made bed and a window that framed the rolling prairie beyond. John paused in the doorway. "I'll come by in the morning, Miss Harper, to see your set." His gaze was steady, almost protective, as he tucked a stray lock of her dark hair behind her ear. Elizabeth's heart fluttered both from gratitude and an inexplicable awareness that this stranger's concern went deeper than mere courtesy. "Thank you, Mr." she began. "Just John." He tipped his hat, then turned and strode into the night, leaving Elizabeth leaning against the door jamb. The hush settled in the boarding house, broken only by the creak of floorboards and distant murmurs from the saloon next door. Elizabeth removed her bonnet and shawl, folding them on the small dresser. As her mind raced, she had left Boston with dreams of romance and stability, sold her modest belongings, endured a perilous journey only to be rescued by a rugged rancher who knew nothing of her plan. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Elizabeth descended to the breakfast table to find a simple spread of porridge biscuits and hickory-smoked bacon. Mrs. Fletcher poured her a cup of coffee strong enough to burn at the edges. "Hope you got your nerve back," the landlady said, sliding a plate toward her. Elizabeth nodded, pushing the food around as she considered her next move. She still had Thomas Caldwell's letter, a proposal from a prominent Pine Creek rancher promising marriage and a stake in his land. If she arrived before him, she would secure her place here. With coffee draining her nerves and determination rekindled, Elizabeth tucked the letter and a small stack of correspondence into her satchel. She navigated back outside where the town's residents bustled about a burly blacksmith, hammering horseshoes, children trailing behind their mothers, local ranch hands loading hay onto wagons. At the far end of the street stood Caldwell's expansive two-story ranch house, its veranda gleaming white in the morning sun. Heart pounding, Elizabeth approached the swing-door saloon where she'd been instructed to meet Thomas. Pushing inside, she found thick carpets of sawdust underfoot and a haze of tobacco smoke hanging between the patrons. Conversations hushed as she entered. Men paused mid-sip to gauge the new arrival. At a back table, the broad-shouldered figure of Thomas Caldwell sat nursing a tumbler of whiskey. His crisp attire and stern features suggested a man used to command, yet his eyes flicked up with polite curiosity when she stepped forward. "Miss Harper?" he asked, voice cool. She offered her gloved hand. "Thomas Caldwell." Her smile wavered under his measured gaze. He spread a ledger and 2 letters across the table, an authenticated photograph dated 5 years prior and her own taken just weeks ago. "Your pictures," he said flatly. "They don't match." Elizabeth's heart sank, familiar warmth draining away. She swallowed, voice small but steady. "That photograph is recent. I sent it as soon as I could afford a photographer." Thomas's lip curled. "At 35, Miss Harper, I expected a wife who looks her age and one who bears no illusions. I need someone to build my ranch's future, not cling to the past." His words fell like gravel in her chest. Disappointment scorched her cheeks, but she squared her shoulders. "Perhaps you meant to marry a younger woman," she replied quietly. "But I'm here now, willing to earn my place whether as your wife or as something else this town needs." Thomas sighed, pushing the whiskey toward her. "I've arranged your fare home," he said, standing. "You can stay at Fletcher's until the coach leaves. I'll send for you if I change my mind." Without waiting for a response, he strode out, leaving Elizabeth gripping the edge of the table as the saloon's murmur resumed around her. Outside, the sun's brightness stung her vision, yet beneath her disappointment, a spark of defiance ignited. She realized that Pine Creek, with all its dangers and prejudices, might offer something more authentic than the half-promised security of a mismatched marriage. As Thomas's dusted boots vanished around the corner, Elizabeth gathered her satchel and stepped back into the morning light, resolve settling into her spine. She would not flee back to Boston on his terms. Instead, she would forge a new path, one shaped by her own hands, and the unexpected alliances waiting in this rugged land. Elizabeth stepped out of the saloon into the crisp air, her heart still pounding from the encounter with Thomas Caldwell. The sun rode high in a cloudless sky, casting sharp shadows across Pine Creek's wide main street. She paused on the wooden sidewalk, drawing a deep breath of sage-scented breeze, steeling herself against the sting of rejection. She might have come west in search of marriage, but her purpose remained unbroken, to build a life here, no matter the obstacles. She set her satchel on the steps of Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house and squared her shoulders before climbing the porch's creaking boards. Mrs. Fletcher met her at the door, eyebrow arched. Well, the landlady's tone mixed curiosity and no small amount of concern. Elizabeth exhaled. "He sent my fare home." She paused, letting the words settle. "But I won't go." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes softened. "Good." She ushered Elizabeth inside. "This town isn't worth giving up over one man." Over breakfast, fresh ham, soft-boiled eggs, and sweetened coffee, the landlady laid out Elizabeth's options. "The council's meetings tonight at the church," she said. "They're talking about selling the old schoolhouse foundation on the North Ridge. Could be worth something to the townfolk." Elizabeth's curiosity flared. "Schoolhouse?" she asked between sips. Mrs. Fletcher nodded. "Children's learning ain't nobody's priority around here, but some are thinking maybe it's time to change that." "If you're a teacher," she let the sentence hang. Elizabeth's mind raced. An unfinished school could give her the standing she needed, a role the town couldn't ignore. By mid-afternoon, Elizabeth made her way to the North Ridge. The remains of the old school stood like a half-written letter, only stone foundation and half-erected timber frames battered by wind and rain. Tall grass and wildflowers choked the corners. She stepped inside the skeleton of the building boots sinking into damp soil. With the mountains rising behind her and Pine Creek spread below, she imagined voices of children echoing against the timbers, lessons and laughter mingling with the mountain air. She pulled out her satchel and retrieved a folded curriculum, outlined handwritten notes on geography, arithmetic, reading. When she unfolded it, the sun glinted on her penmanship, neat loops and firm strokes that spoke of years at the chalkboard. As she traced the words, a sense of purpose filled her chest. Here lay her opportunity to present herself at the council meeting as the teacher Pine Creek needed to resurrect its school. At dusk, the church on Main Street filled with anxious townspeople. Candles flickered in lace-trimmed windows, their faces illuminated with curiosity. A long table faced the congregation. 5 men in dusty coats sat behind it. Judge William Hargrove at center, flanked by the grizzled sheriff, the stern banker, the shopkeeper, and a mining foreman in a threadbare coat. Elizabeth took a deep breath and stepped forward when Judge Hargrove called the meeting to order. "My friends," the judge began, voice carrying the weight of years on the bench, "we gather to decide the fate of the old schoolhouse foundation. Should we auction it off for lumber or restore it for our children?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elizabeth walked to the front with measured steps, her satchel slung at her side. "Judge Hargrove, council members." "Everyone," she said, voice firm yet welcoming. "My name is Elizabeth Harper. I'm a teacher from Massachusetts. I came here seeking marriage, but found I'd rather teach." A hush fell. She opened her satchel and produced the curriculum, laying it before the judge. "I propose we complete this schoolhouse, furnish it, and begin classes this fall. I bring experience developing multi-age lesson plans, creating community-supported funding, and building curriculum around local life, agriculture, geography, civic duty." She gestured toward the ridgeline where wildflowers nodded in the breeze. "Education isn't luxury, it's foundation." Skepticism flitted across the faces before her. The banker folded his arms. The foreman frowned. The sheriff shifted in his chair. Then the stern shopkeeper, Marcus Jenkins, leaned forward. "And who'll pay for all this?" he challenged. Elizabeth met his gaze. "I'd ask the council to allocate a modest tax on mining shipments, matched by community donations. Several ranchers have offered timber. I've drafted estimates based on local prices." She tapped the figures with confidence. A voice from the back rang out. "Who is this young lady anyway?" Thomas Caldwell stood near the door, silhouette half hidden by candlelight. Murmured approval arose when she glanced up and answered without hesitation. "A teacher dedicated to building Pine Creek's future." Before the council could reply, another voice spoke, deep and steady. John McAllister rose from the third row, silver hair gleaming in candlelight. He carried a leather-bound trunk. "I'll vouch for her," he said, his tone calm authority itself. The crowd turned to him in surprise. He approached the table, setting the trunk before Judge Hargrove. "These," he said, lifting the lid to reveal dozens of leather-bound books reading primers, atlases, natural history volumes, the personal library of his late wife, Clara. She collected these for teaching children. Gasps echoed through the church. Judge Hargrove leaned over, examining the volumes. "Where did these come from?" he asked. John's gaze fixed on Elizabeth. "They belong to the schoolhouse," he said softly, "and to Miss Harper, if she accepts them." Murmurs of admiration rippled through the assembly. The banker rubbed his chin. The foreman nodded. Even Thomas Caldwell's jaw clenched. Judge Hargrove sat back and cleared his throat. "Miss Harper, with Mr. McAllister's support and these resources, we have little choice. We'll allocate funds to complete the schoolhouse and engage Miss Harper as our teacher on a 3-month trial basis." All in favor hands shot up. Only 1 or 2 remained lowered. The vote carried. As the meeting adjourned, townspeople crowded around Elizabeth, offering timber labor, even sewing curtains. John McAllister moved to her side, eyes alight. Welcome to Pine Creek, Miss Harper, he said with a wry grin. Elizabeth's heart swelled. She had arrived alone, but now stood at the center of a community ready to build its future, her future together. Dawn broke over Pine Creek with a pale golden glow that filtered through frost-lined windows. Elizabeth Harper awoke before the roosters, her dreams still echoing with John McAllister's steady voice in the courthouse's murmur of approval. She rose quietly in her modest boarding house room, repositioned a stack of her late wife's books on the small desk by the window, and traced her fingers over their leather spines, feeling the weight of Clara McAllister's legacy in her palm. Outside, the town stirred, the blacksmith's hammer rang against hot iron, and the baker's wood-fired oven sent warm fragrance drifting down Main Street. Elizabeth wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the crisp morning air, inhaling deep as she made her way toward the schoolhouse ridge. The winter grass crunched beneath her boots, and the distant peaks glowed rosy pink as the sun crested the horizon. At the foundation site, a flurry of activity awaited. Local carpenters, men in wide-brimmed hats and patched denim, worked to raise sturdy pine beams into place. They heaved long timbers with grunts, braced them against supports, then measured and cut with precision. A small crew of ranch hands offloaded John's donated lumber from wagons, stacking it methodically along the foundation's edge. Tools clanged, muffled curses flew. Elizabeth surveyed the scene with proud eyes. She strode forward, gathering the workers' attention. "Good morning," she called, above the din, voice bright and confident. "Let's ensure today we square these walls and set the joists for the floor. We'll be ready for roofing by week's end, just in time for the first snowfall." The foreman, Joseph Carter, a veteran builder with silver flecks in his beard, nodded approvingly. "Aye, Miss Harper. Lead the way." Elizabeth checked her pocket watch, nearly 8 o'clock. Time to don her teacher's mantle, in addition to her four-person's cap. She took out her slate and chalk, sketching quick diagrams on a portable blackboard propped against a beam, the ridge geography for geography lessons, measurements for arithmetic, and a list of names to assign each worker a daily safety notice. The men paused to watch, some folding arms, others resting hammers against shoulders, as Elizabeth explained how even simple construction tasks could serve as practical math problems for Pine Creek's children. At midday, a wagon loaded with hay rattled past, drawn by John's sturdy draft horses. John himself sat in the driver's seat, bareheaded, guiding the horses, with reins coiled around his calloused hands. As he approached the schoolhouse, he saw Elizabeth chalking the slope of a roofline. He tugged the reins, bringing the wagon to a gentle halt. Several bales of pea straw slumped forward in the bed. "Thought you might need bedding for temporary flooring," John called down. He hopped off and lifted a bale with ease, setting it by the entrance. Elizabeth hurried forward, cheeks flushed. "This will protect the subfloor from mud and keep things leveled for students," she said gratefully. She reached to retrieve a book, Longfellow's Poems, from her desk, but found instead John's salve tin tucked into a work coat pocket. He handed it over with a gentle nod. "I figured you'd earned it," he said simply. His eyes lingered on the beams overhead, then on Elizabeth's determined face. She opened the tin, inhaling the sweet herbal scent of beeswax and calendula. "Thank you," she breathed, impossible to convey the depth of gratitude in mere words. John tipped his hat and climbed back onto the wagon, which rattled away down the dusty track. Afternoon sunlight warmed the ridge as Elizabeth organized the final tasks, measuring joists for floorboards, marking windows for cutouts, and assigning workers to finish the foundation bolts. As the last beam locked into place, she sounded an imaginary school bell in her mind. Soon these timbers would hold desks and slates. Soon children's voices would fill the space. She wiped sweat and sawdust from her brow, then paused to take in the highest ridge view. Pine Creek nestled in a valley of pines, smoke curling from cabin chimneys, laundry lines fluttering in gentle breeze. Wildflowers, clover, poppies, asters swayed against the project's wooden frame, brilliant spots of color amid raw lumber. Elizabeth smiled, her heart full. The schoolhouse was rising like hope itself, solid, purposeful, a testament to community effort and the unbreakable spirit of a teacher who refused to turn back. As twilight settled over Pine Creek, Elizabeth Harper lingered at the schoolhouse ridge, her breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. The newly erected frame stood like a skeletal promise against the dimming sky, each beam and joist a testament to the day's labors. With the workers gone, save for a lone lamplight bobbing on Mrs. Fletcher's distant porch, she stepped inside the structure and ran her gloved hand along a rough plank, imagining the day when young voices would bounce off these timbers. She unpacked her satchel on a makeshift desk crafted from a work table John McAllister had donated. From its depths, she retrieved Sarah McAllister's teaching journal pages of neat script outlining seasonal lesson plans and botanical specimens. Tonight, under the soft glow of an oil lantern, hung from a rafter, Elizabeth would refine her curriculum, mapping local flora in spring, integrating ranch math exercises in summer, and teaching civic responsibility in autumn, all inspired by Sarah's careful notes. A soft rustle sounded behind her. Startled, Elizabeth turned to find John McAllister standing in the doorway, hat in hand and silhouette softened by lamplight. "Couldn't let you have all the quiet up here," he said quietly, closing the distance. Despite the day's grime on his sleeves, he looked composed, yet his eyes betrayed a weariness she recognized from her nights in Concord, wrestling uncertainty. Elizabeth inclined her head, motioning to a wooden stool. "I didn't expect you," she replied, voice warm but cautious. John lowered himself onto the stool, the lantern light casting strong shadows across his lined face. "Thought you might need company. And to see if the frame held tonight's wind." He pointed toward a rafter joint that had creaked under yesterday's gusts. She crossed to the joint and ran her fingers over the mortise and tenon connection. "Solid," she confirmed. "Joseph Carter and his crew did a fine job." A flicker of a smile softened John's stern mouth. They work best when someone leads with confidence. His gaze drifted to the old journal spread across the desk. "Sarah McAllister left you quite a guide." Elizabeth closed the book carefully. She did. Her notes have been invaluable, not just teaching ideas, but insight into living out here. She understood that education isn't just lessons in a classroom, but tools for life. The words hung between them, and for a moment they shared a quiet understanding, two teachers separated by years yet united in purpose. Outside, the wind deepened, causing the lantern flame to flicker. Elizabeth rose and moved to the entrance, steadying the lantern's hook. "This night air reminds me of home," she said softly. John joined her, hands resting on the sill. "Massachusetts?" he asked. She inclined her head. "Yes, but tonight Pine Creek feels more like home than I ever imagined." He nodded, gaze fixed on the valley below where lamplights dotted the sleeping town like fallen stars. "It's a good place for second chances," he said after a pause. "I built my ranch on these slopes decades ago with Sarah by my side. After she passed, I kept to myself, thought my life was over. But seeing you stand up there ready to build hope for these children, I wondered if I'd been wrong." Her heart stirred at his confession, this rugged rancher whose unexpected kindness had saved her life, now revealing his own battered soul. She turned to face him. "You saved me twice, first from the outlaws, then by giving me these books and your support." She placed a hand lightly over his. "I hope I can repay you by making this school a success." John's rough palm covered hers and he gave a small, almost imperceptible squeeze. "No debt between us. Just promise me one thing: when the first bell rings and those children stream in, save me a seat at the back." His tone was gentle but carried weight. Elizabeth's lips curved in a soft smile. "It will be waiting." They stood side by side as the lantern guttered the wind, carrying distant hoots of an owl and the low murmur of night creatures stirring in the pines. The schoolhouse, half-built but full of promise, seemed to breathe around them, its skeleton frame poised to become a living center of learning. In that shared silence, Elizabeth and John both felt the quiet thrill of possibilities, a community healed by education, a teacher forging her path, and a bond between two souls that neither expected, but both welcomed. As the lantern dimmed to its final glow, Elizabeth tipped it slightly to shield it from the draft, then relit the flame with careful precision, an emblem of her own rekindled hope. With John's tall silhouette beside her, she felt the strength to face tomorrow's challenges, raising walls, gathering students, and forging connections in a town once skeptical, now ready to embrace its first true school. And as they stepped out into the chill night, Elizabeth Harper knew that this mountain town, once a mere waypoint on her journey, had become the home she never knew she needed. The first light of dawn filtered through the thin curtains of Elizabeth Harper's new cottage, painting the small room in soft gold. The cottage, rebuilt timber and stone, stood at the eastern edge of John McAllister's ranch, a mile from Main Street, yet close enough to hear the town stir. Elizabeth rose quietly, mindful of the gentle creak in the floorboards, and dressed in her best dark blue calico dress with crisp white collar. Today was the official ribbon-cutting ceremony for the schoolhouse, and she wanted to greet the townsfolk as both teacher and hostess. Downstairs, the cottage's parlor furnished modestly with a wooden rocking chair John had carved, and the baker's gift of patterned drapes held a small table set with tea and biscuits. Elizabeth set out teacups and the tin of herbal salve John had given her, a reminder of shared labors and kindness. She paused by the window, scanning the distant ridge where the schoolhouse stood framed against the rising sun, a beacon of promise. With a deep breath, she caught sight of movement on the ranch road, a line of wagons hauling benches, a modest band of fiddler and drummer, and a scattering of townsfolk headed inward, shawls and hats bobbing in the dawn breeze. Elizabeth grabbed her satchel, slipping in Sarah's journal and a bundle of chalk. She stepped onto the porch just as John pulled up in a second wagon laden with toolboxes and a neatly coiled ribbon of bright red cloth. He climbed down, wiping his hands on a rag. "Morning," he greeted, voice warm. Elizabeth smiled, gesturing toward the winding road. "Looks like Pine Creek's come to celebrate." He nodded, taking in the sight. They wouldn't miss this for the world. Elizabeth felt a thrill, years of longing for validation as a teacher, and now her cottage stood at the threshold of a new community. She led John inside briefly to fetch a silver basin and pitcher Mrs. Fletcher had loaned her for ceremonial hand-washing at the school entrance, an old ritual Elizabeth had adapted to lend formality to the day. By 8:30, a parade formed, two ranch hands holding poles draped with floral garlands. Children from the local orphanage giggling and carrying banners, Harriet Miller tipping her hat with pride, and even Thomas Caldwell standing aloof but respectful among the crowd. Elizabeth and John stepped into the lead wagon, and with a gentle flick of the reins, John guided the horses toward the ridge. The procession moved steadily up the winding trail, the rhythmic thud of hooves echoing against the morning hush. At the crest, the schoolhouse greeted them, fresh lumber, newly painted window frames, and the red ribbon stretched across the doorway. Judge Hargrove stood beside a makeshift podium, staff members and townsfolk forming a semicircle. As Elizabeth descended from the wagon, children ran ahead to perch on bales of straw, voices ringing with excitement. Elderly couples leaned on canes, bridesmaids in town skirts held bouquets of daisies. Pine Creek had come together in force. John held the basin and pitcher, and Elizabeth dipped her hands in the cool water, an echo of rural dedications she had read about back east. As she turned to face the crowd, the sun broke fully over the horizon, illuminating her determined features. Judge Hargrove tapped a small hammer on the podium. "Today," he began, voice carrying authority and warmth, "we dedicate this schoolhouse to the education of Pine Creek's children. We thank Miss Elizabeth Harper for her vision and Mr. John McAllister for his generous support." He gestured to Elizabeth, who accepted a pair of scissors with shaking hands. With John by her side and the judge standing behind, Elizabeth cut the ribbon. A cheer burst forth, applause echoing down the ridge. Children surged forward, peeking through the open doors with wide eyes. Inside the blackboard awaited chalk desks lined up in neat rows, and Sarah's books, now part of a growing collection, rested on a handcrafted shelf. Elizabeth stepped inside the gravel, crunching under her boots, and motioned for the children to follow. They scampered in, seating themselves as she swept the chalk across the board, writing "Welcome to Pine Creek School." She turned back to the crowd, voice strong and clear. "Today, we begin a journey together, discovering geography, arithmetic, reading, and the wonders of this land we call home. May this place be a beacon of hope and learning for generations to come." As the crowd dispersed to explore the schoolhouse and greet neighbors, Elizabeth and John exchanged a look of shared triumph. The walls stood solid, the ribbon's scarlet threads fluttering at the entrance, a symbol of what happens when community and compassion intertwine. Elizabeth closed her eyes, breathing in the morning's crisp air, and whispered, "Thank you." John's quiet nod and the gentle touch of his hand on her shoulder told her that at last she had found her true place in Pine Creek, surrounded by the promise of children's laughter and the steadfast support of a silver-haired rancher who saw her worth from the very start. The morning after the dedication dawned cool and bright, the first frost still clinging to the grasses on the ridge. Elizabeth Harper rose before sunrise, her mind already alive with lesson plans. Today would be her first official day of teaching, and she resolved to greet each student by name, assess their abilities, and foster a sense of excitement for learning. She dressed in sturdy riding attire, a practical skirt, well-worn leather boots, and a tailored jacket, and tucked a slate and chalk into her satchel alongside Sarah McAllister's journal. Outside, the ranch road wound steeply upward, but John McAllister met her at the barn with a waiting wagon. He tipped his hat in a small gesture of encouragement. "First day jitters?" he asked, flashing a rare, gentle smile. Elizabeth nodded, gripping the side of the wagon. Just a bit. John settled the reins and lifted his voice to the horses, sending them trotting down the road toward the schoolhouse ridge. Along the way, Elizabeth spotted familiar faces from the dedication Mrs. Fletcher watering her flower beds, Harriet Miller stepping out of her shop with bolts of cloth under one arm, the orphanage matron waving from a distance. The town's support, once uncertain, now felt unwavering. As they approached the ridge, the schoolhouse came into view with a semblance of purpose: open doors, half-drawn curtains, and the flicker of candlelight visible through new window panes. Elizabeth disembarked and gave John a grateful nod. "Thank you," she said softly. John tipped his hat. "Good luck in there, babe." She offered a small smile in return, then turned toward the doorway. The polished wood of the threshold gleamed in the morning light as she stepped inside, finding 27 eager faces arranged in neat rows at the desks. Children, some shy, some wide-eyed, with anticipation looked up at her. "Good morning, class," she greeted, her voice steady but warm. "I'm Miss Harper. Today we begin our journey of learning together." She glanced at her list of names, the Wheeler twins bashful and clutching each other's hands, James Peterson, lanky and curious, the Crawford siblings whose Uncle Thomas had reluctantly endorsed their attendance. She moved down the front row, pronouncing each name clearly and welcoming each child to their new school. Once introductions concluded, Elizabeth rang a small bell on her desk, her makeshift school bell. "Today we'll start with reading," she announced. "But first let us learn about this place where we live." She walked to the chalkboard and drew a simple map of the town and surrounding county, marking the saloon, blacksmith, ranch lands, and the winding stage route. The children leaned forward, fascinated. She explained how geography shaped their lives, where crops thrived, where water lay, and how mountain passes connected them to the world beyond. As the morning sun climbed, she divided the class into small reading groups, then moved among them to hear individual voices recite letters and simple words. Some stumbled, others read fluently, but each child received praise and encouragement. Elizabeth kept careful notes in Sarah's journal, planning targeted lessons for each reading level. Between sessions, she allowed brief breaks for the children to stretch and share stories about their own experiences, riding horses, helping at home, or chasing rabbits in the fields. Meanwhile, John McAllister arrived at the schoolyard with a crate of supplies, slates, chalk, ink pots, and parchment. He positioned the crate beside Elizabeth's desk and nodded. She offered him a grateful smile, then invited the children to choose their slates and begin arithmetic. She sketched sums on the board, simple additions involving ranch chores like counting fence posts or dividing hay bales, and watched as the students tackled the problems with enthusiasm. By midday, Elizabeth gathered the class for a reading of Longfellow's The Village Blacksmith, the poem Sarah had once used to teach character and labor's dignity. Elizabeth read aloud, her clear voice carrying across the room, and then invited the older children to take turns. Faces lit up with pride, and even the Wheeler twins whispered each line with surprising clarity. As the lesson concluded, the schoolhouse door swung open and the soft figure of Harriet Miller appeared, carrying steaming bowls of stew. The aroma of beef, potatoes, and fresh herbs drifted in, drawing hungry smiles from the children. "Thought you might be ready for a hot meal," Harriet said, setting bowls on low tables. The children ate eagerly while Elizabeth thanked Harriet for the kindness. Harriet winked. "A good teacher deserves a good meal." Later, Elizabeth dismissed the class, instructing them to return tomorrow at the same time. The children trooped out, laughter and chatter echoing down the hill. Elizabeth remained gathering slates and stowing books when John reappeared. He had returned to ensure all went smoothly and perhaps to witness the fruits of his wife's legacy and his own support. He approached quietly, watching Elizabeth record attendance in the journal. "How did it feel?" he asked softly. She met his gaze, eyes bright with fulfillment. "Like everything I've ever wanted to do," John nodded, then surprised her by asking, "Would you like company this afternoon? I thought we might inspect the ranch fields for a future nature study, tell the children about local flora and wildlife." Her heart skipped. "I'd like that," she replied, warmth flooding her cheeks. They walked down the ridge together, their steps falling into a companionable silence. The schoolhouse stood behind them, its windows catching the sun, a testament to community and perseverance. Elizabeth knew that day's success would ripple through Pine Creek for generations to come, and that her partnership with John, forged in rescue and reaffirmed in shared purpose, had only just begun to bloom. Late afternoon sunlight bathed the ridge in warm honey tones as Elizabeth Harper and John McAllister made their way down the winding wagon trail toward Wilson Ranch. The invitation, unusually personal, had filled Elizabeth with nervous excitement. She had taught 27 children in 2 days, but the prospect of interacting with her grizzled rancher benefactor outside the schoolhouse felt like stepping beyond professional courtesy into uncharted territory. John guided the two-horse wagon with practiced ease, the creak of wooden wheels over packed earth blending with distant cattle lowing. Elizabeth sat beside him on a rough-hewn bench, her satchel resting in her lap. She wore a practical blouse and skirt suited for travel, hair pinned back to keep stray strands from her eyes. In her hand, she held Sarah McAllister's journal, its pages now dog-eared from constant reference. They passed grazing cattle that lifted their heads in idle interest in fields of wildflowers nodding in the breeze. As they crested a small rise, the main ranch house came into view, sprawling logs darkened by age, a broad porch furnished with rocking chairs, and a cluster of outbuildings, barn corrals, and smokehouse, radiating a quiet solidity. John reined the horses to a halt. "Welcome to home," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of pride. Elizabeth surveyed the house, imagining the simple joys and hardships woven into its beams. "It's beautiful," she replied, stepping down and smoothing her skirt. John helped her land lightly on the ground. They entered through the front door, where a friendly ranch hand Miguel paused from cleaning tack. "Afternoon, Mr. McAllister," Miguel greeted with a nod, then looked to Elizabeth. "Miss Harper, ma'am, welcome back." Elizabeth offered a polite smile as Miguel resumed his work. The house's interior smelled of pine and cooking stew. John led Elizabeth into the parlor where a table held a spread of fresh bread cheese and a big pot of chicken and vegetable stew. "Thought you could use a hot meal after the drive," he said, gesturing to a place at the table. Elizabeth seated herself and John ladled fragrant stew into her bowl. They ate in companionable silence, punctuated only by the clink of spoons and the occasional grunt of appreciation from Elizabeth. Afterwards, John rose and took Elizabeth's cup. "Come," he said, motioning toward a side door that opened onto a path leading to a wildflower meadow on the north ridge. The meadow, recently pointed out by John, was aglow with late-season asters, Indian paintbrush, and Queen Anne's lace. Elizabeth followed him, journal in hand, as he guided her among tall stalks and vibrant blooms. "This," he said, kneeling to inspect a cluster of purple asters, "is one of Sarah's favorites." She taught the children how to harvest specimens without harming the plant, pressing leaves in her journal. He gestured to fresh blossoms swaying in the breeze. Elizabeth knelt beside him and ran her fingers along a stem. "They're lovely," she murmured, eyes alight. She snapped open the journal to Sarah's notes, descriptions of petals, pollinators, and seasonal changes. John studied Elizabeth's face as she read. "She trusted her journal with only a few," he said quietly. "Thought it might help another teacher." Elizabeth's gaze lifted to his gratitude and something more in her eyes. "I'll make sure her work lives on," she vowed. John nodded, seeming to find solace in her commitment. They walked back toward the ranch house, stepping over grassy mounds where prairie dogs darted in and out of holes. John spoke of his morning rounds, checking fences, inspecting calves, and Elizabeth listened, absorbing local ranch knowledge she planned to weave into lessons. "My class will learn about livestock weights and feeding schedules," she said thoughtfully. "Math lessons tailored to ranch life." John's lips curved in a rare smile. Back at the house, Elizabeth offered to help Mrs. Jensen, the ranch cook, wash dishes in a wide porcelain sink. They scrubbed pots and pans while chatting about Pine Creek's womenfolk and upcoming county fair events. Elizabeth learned that Mrs. Jensen's daughter would be in the pie baking contest and that she herself hoped to teach a quilting class next summer. Each detail Elizabeth filed away as possible community lessons on practical skills that bridged academics with local culture. Late afternoon light caught on the barn's red siding as John led Elizabeth toward it. He opened the wide double doors, revealing stalls lined with sleek horses and rows of saddles. "Thought you might like to see where these children learn responsibility," he said. Elizabeth stroked a bay mare's mane, marveling at its warmth under her hand. John explained proper feeding, grooming, and the care needed during winter months. She made mental notes to invite the children for a barn demonstration in spring. As twilight deepened, they returned to the porch rocking chairs, waiting under Mike's sweeps of lantern light. John fetched 2 mugs of hot cider from the kitchen, steam mingling with the cool air. They sipped quietly, watching fireflies wink between the cottonwoods. Elizabeth felt a sense of peaceful belonging. Finally, John broke the silence. "You've done wonders at that school," he said, "bringing it alive in less than a week." Elizabeth smiled, heartwarmed by his praise. I had help, she replied, inclining her head toward the ranch house and beyond to Pine Creek. And a reason to believe. John set his mug down and studied her face shadow and lantern glow dancing across his features. Elizabeth, he began, voice soft. She turned to him, anticipating more than he spoke. He cleared his throat. Would you consider making this place your home beyond the schoolhouse? I have a cottage you're free to live in. Elizabeth's breath caught. His offer, so generous, so unexpected, stirred emotions she dared not name. She looked out at the flickering fireflies, then back at him. John, she said quietly, I already feel at home here. He reached out and touched her hand lightly, a gesture filled with unspoken understanding. They sat together in comfortable silence as night settled over Wilson Ranch, two souls finding solace and promise in shared purpose, the ranch's heartbeat echoing their own. The first frost of autumn crept over Pine Creek as Elizabeth Harper stepped onto the porch of her cottage, invitation to John McAllister's Sunday dinner in hand. The sun sat low, painting long shadows across the prairie grass. Elizabeth paused to take in the crisp air, inhaling the scent of pine and wood smoke. Today marked her first invitation to dinner, not as a teacher or guest of honor, but as an invited friend of the rancher whose kindness had changed her life. Inside, Elizabeth set her satchel by the door and smoothed the front of her tailored jacket, nerves fluttering in her stomach. After the rigors of the week teaching geography and arithmetic, coordinating construction, and guiding hands-on lessons at Wilson Ranch, this dinner felt like crossing an unseen threshold. She descended the narrow stairs to the kitchen, where Mrs. Jensen bustled amid pots and ladles, the aroma of roasted pheasant and root vegetables filling the room. Evening, Miss Harper, Mrs. Jensen greeted with a warm smile, flipping a crisp loaf onto the counter. Hope you're hungry. I am, Elizabeth replied, smiling despite her excitement. Thank you for having me. Mrs. Jensen winked. That rancher of yours knows how to show appreciation. She ladled steaming gravy into a tureen and set out platters of golden brown pheasant breast, buttered potatoes, and honey-roasted carrots. Elizabeth arranged place settings on the long farmhouse table, a polished beam salvaged from the old schoolhouse foundation, slipping the silverware neatly beside each plate. Outside the kitchen window, the sun dipped below the western ridge, setting the sky aflame. Elizabeth wiped her hands and moved to the front door, just as John approached on foot, hat in hand, and a pleased glint in his clear blue eyes. He carried a small bouquet of asters tied with burlap twine. I thought these might brighten things up, he said, handing them to her. Elizabeth accepted the flowers, their late-season colors vivid against her dark dress. They're perfect, she replied softly. John nodded and stepped inside, shedding his coat to reveal crisp shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He shook hands with Mrs. Jensen in thanks and followed Elizabeth into the parlor. The bouquet found its place in a mason jar on the center of the table. Elizabeth took a deep breath as John poured 2 glasses of cider, their sweet spice mingling with the stew's aroma. They entered the dining room, where the long table was set for 6. Mrs. Fletcher would join them, as would Harriet Miller, and to Elizabeth's mild surprise, Judge William Hargrove. The judge greeted them with a steady nod, sliding into his seat at the head of the table. Harriet and Mrs. Fletcher sat to either side, exchanging friendly murmurs as Elizabeth and John took the 2 seats in the middle. Silence settled for a moment as the family seated, then Mrs. Jensen emerged with the first serving dish, the roasted pheasant, its skin glazed to a gleam. She carved slices with practiced precision, placing generous portions on each plate. Conversation began with small talk, village gossip, the evening's chill, the county fair's upcoming festivities. Elizabeth listened, her heart warmed by the genuine camaraderie. Judge Hargrove spoke of the school's progress. Miss Harper, the council reports glowing reviews. Parents can already see improvements in their children's reading and math. Elizabeth's cheeks colored. It's been remarkable to witness their enthusiasm, she replied. They apply themselves eagerly. The judge's stern expression softened into a small smile. I believe education will shape Pine Creek's future more than any railroad could. Harriet chimed in next, describing forest bounty, edible mushrooms, and wild huckleberries, handy knowledge for Elizabeth's nature studies. We should plan a foraging lesson, Elizabeth proposed, noting teacher's eyes lighting. Harriet nodded. I can lead the gathering, share recipes and proper identification. The table hummed with approval. Elizabeth glanced at John. He raised his glass in silent support. As platters emptied and Mrs. Jensen brought in bowls of buttery potatoes and steaming carrots, conversation turned to ranch matters. Judge Hargrove asked John about livestock counts and winter feed plans. John answered with thoughtful detail, his tone shifting from rancher to steward of land and animals. Elizabeth found herself transfixed. Every explanation, every anecdote about feeding schedules or herd movements she cataloged as lessons for her students. Later, the pot roast made its appearance, tender beef that melted at the touch of the fork, followed by spiced apple pie and vanilla cream. When dessert arrived, Harriet raised her fork. To the teacher who transformed our schoolhouse, and to the rancher who made it possible. Glasses clinked, and Elizabeth felt a swell of gratitude and belonging. As candlelight danced on the walls, John leaned close to Elizabeth. "Thank you for accepting," he said quietly so only she could hear. She smiled, the fingers brushing his. "Thank you for inviting me." The rest of the table resumed animated chatter, but Elizabeth and John shared a moment of stillness amid the warmth and laughter. When the meal concluded, Elizabeth excused herself to the porch to gather fresh air. The sky held lingering embers of twilight, and distant stars shimmered above the silhouette of the schoolhouse ridge. John joined her, hands tucked into his coat pockets. They stood side by side, companionable silence bridging the space between them. After a moment, John spoke. "You've become part of this place more than just the school teacher." Elizabeth turned to him, heart fluttering. "I feel at home here," she said softly. He lowered his gaze to meet hers, vulnerability in his eyes. "And I want you here," he replied. They shared a quiet understanding. No grand declarations, but the unspoken promise of partnership. Under the vast Wyoming sky, two souls, one seeking purpose, the other seeking solace, found both in each other. The ranch house's lanterns glowed behind them, and the newly christened schoolhouse stood sentinel on the ridge. Elizabeth Harper knew that in this rugged land of possibility, she and John McAllister had built more than a school, they had built the beginning of a life together. As winter's first snow-dusted Pine Creek, Elizabeth Harper rose before dawn, her breath mingling with the chill in the cottage's silent air. She dressed in layers, wool skirt, knitted shawl, her steadiest boots as she prepared for the weekly journey to the town center. Today marked 1 month since the school's grand opening, and Elizabeth had organized a community reading event at the local library using John McAllister's donated books to engage families in storytelling and literacy games. She carried Sarah McAllister's journal in her satchel, now filled with new entries, lesson observations, children's progress notes, and samples of local poetry collected by Harriet Miller. The cottage door creaked softly as she closed it, and the track outside crunched under her steps. A wagon awaited, harnessed to John's 2 horses waiting in the morning light. John stood by the near wheel, breath pluming in the crisp air. "Ready for our next adventure?" he asked, his voice warm. Elizabeth smiled and climbed aboard, nuzzling her cheeks against the wind. They drove down the snow-dusted road toward town, the world crisp and quiet save for the horses' hooves and the pale whistle of wind through bare branches. The library's sign on a painted oak leaf surrounded by gold letters greeted them as they drew up nearby. Inside, the room glowed with lamplight and anticipation. Townspeople, parents bundled in coats and scarves, crowded benches around a large table strewn with books and paper. Emily Watson, the librarian, welcomed Elizabeth and John with broad smiles. The children's eager faces reflected Elizabeth's own anticipation. This event would cement the school as a center of community learning. Elizabeth arranged a circle of chairs and led the first reading, The Night Before Frost, a local tale embroidered with Pine Creek's winter lore. John sat in the back, hands folded, his presence a silent pillar of support. The children chimed in on repeated refrains, and parents nodded approval, exchanging glances that spoke of gratitude. Next came literacy games, flashcard matches, and word puzzles based on ranch life, bale fence saddle. Elizabeth paired parents with children for collaborative challenges, fostering both learning and familial bonds. John joined a group at one end, offering gentle guidance to a mother struggling to help her shy daughter pronounce prairie. Elizabeth watched him, heart-stirring at his patient encouragement. After games, Elizabeth introduced a special surprise, a collection of nature journals filled with sketches and notes from the North Meadows wildflowers. The children gathered around a small table as Harriet joined her, demonstrating how to press petals and label specimens. The room fell into focused hush, punctuated by whispers of wonder. John observed from a corner, eyes soft as he recalled Sarah's original journals. As the event concluded, Elizabeth distributed small leather bookmarks, each embossed with the school's name, to every participant. Applause filled the library as families thanked her and John. Emily Watson clasped Elizabeth's hand. "This means so much to Pine Creek," she said, voice thick with gratitude. Elizabeth smiled, glancing at John. "We did this together." Later outside, the warm glow of the library snowflakes drifted like tiny stars. John wrapped his coat around Elizabeth's shoulders. She laughed softly as the flakes settled on her hair. "You'll catch pneumonia," he teased. Elizabeth slid her arm through his. "Then I'll catch it with you." They walked arm in arm down Main Street, now dressed in festive lights for the winter solstice. Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house glowed in the distance. Harriet's dress shop's windows displayed quilts and toys, and the tavern sign creaked gently in the wind. Children paused to wave at Elizabeth, and John tipped his hat in return. Reaching the schoolhouse ridge, they paused. The building's new shutters and wreaths of evergreen boughs shimmered under a single lamp above the door. Inside, the desks remained empty until morning classes resumed. Elizabeth took John's hand and led him to the entrance. "Shall we go in?" she asked, voice low. He opened the door, cold air swirling around them. Elizabeth stepped inside, her breath echoing off the walls. She ran her hand along a desk, then placed Sarah's journal on its stand. John removed his hat and stood behind her as she read an entry aloud. "We give our children tools, not answers. We open doors, but they must walk through themselves." Elizabeth closed the journal, voice soft. "We've opened a lot of doors this year." John's arm found her shoulder. "And you've guided us all through." He lifted her chin gently, and she met his steady gaze. Snow drifted against the window panes, and the schoolhouse, once foundation stones and timbers, felt alive with possibility. John lowered his voice. "I want to build our life here together." Elizabeth's eyes glistened. She reached up, brushing a stray strand from his forehead. Together, she agreed, pressing her cheek against his. They lingered in the empty classroom, hearts full as the world outside hushed in winter's embrace. The schoolhouse, their sanctuary of learning and love, stood ready for whatever lay beyond its doors, an enduring testament to hope, partnership, and the promise that when two people build with care, they create a foundation that lasts a lifetime. In the chill of dawn, a once broken path found new purpose. She traveled 1,000 miles seeking a promise, only to see it shatter in a stranger's cold gaze. And yet from that fracture rose something stronger than any bargain, a home built by shared sweat and stubborn hope. The cost was fear in the mountain night, the sting of rejection beneath a saloon's dim lamps, and countless moments of doubt whispered on the ridge. But with every timber raised and every lesson taught, she gained more than a place to belong. She claimed her worth, wove a community together, and discovered that sometimes the greatest rescue comes from within. The final light lingers on empty desks and silent hallways where voices will soon echo again, with question and laughter. In that quiet aftermath, what remains is the promise of tomorrow, rooted in courage, compassion, and hard-won trust. As the camera fades to black, one question lingers in the still air. How far would you go to transform your own broken story into a legacy of hope?